So the idea is, on a given computer, right? So this is, a single node, right? Like by that we mean one computer. You may have multiple services that live on that computer. All right. So for instance, you might have like let's do it this way. Let's say you have your backend API, right? So this is like our backend Flask API. You may have that connect to like a front end, like user interface, meaning it could be Streamlit. Actually, that's what we'll be doing in the lab. It could be like React or some HTML combination of HTML and JavaScript, but we could have this as our front end. And then you can also have, your database, right? Like it could live on the same machine. It doesn't have to, but just for the purpose of example, it could live on the same machine. So this is our database. So Docker Compose will allow us to have 3 separate images, right? For each one of these services, right? What we'll call services. And there are different things. This is this allows us to, it's called like, people say that, like microservices. This pattern of essentially what we're doing is we're splitting up these different components of a website. And what's nice about it is it tends to make things more like Lego blocks, like more flexible, meaning, just the database. If you wanted to, you could connect to that and work with that. We can work just with the API, and it keeps these things separated and, allows us to treat each entity as kind of a value add, and then also allows different teams to work on it. So, one team might just work with the API, building the backend Flask API. Another team might work on the front end API. But when you use Docker Compose, all of these services have to live on the same computer. Okay. If you want them to live on different computers, typically you would use something else for that. You could simply connect to it from the outside. You could use Kubernetes provides some value there as well. But what we're doing is Docker Compose. It will allow us to separate out these different components into different Docker containers, really like different images that will boot up into containers, and then allow these different containers to talk to one another. All right, so that's what this lesson is on. And one of the reasons why we're introducing it now is like Airflow has many different components, and they talk to each other through Docker Compose. All right. Okay. So Docker Compose, it does 2 things. One, it like allows our images / containers to communicate with one another, and we'll see how it does that. The other thing is, and this we'll actually see first, is remember when we boot up our Docker image, we can end up putting like a lot of things in our command line, right? Docker run, like our Flask app, and then remember we have like the -p for the port mapping, 3000 to like 5000, and then maybe we like specify the volume, right? You might have to specify not only the volume but bind mounting. Docker Compose allows us to specify this in the individual composed file. So instead of remembering to put this in the command line, we can just write one command called Docker Compose, and it will know to effectively provide these arguments and provide these command line arguments. So we'll show how that occurs. All right, so these are the 2 purposes. One, like our command line arguments, we can effectively encode them. And then 2, allows our images / containers, like really our containers, to communicate with one another. All right, so let's get into this. So you can see what I have is, I just removed the Docker Compose file, is our Flask app. So what we have is we have this requirements.txt. It just has the Flask library. We have this project, which you can see, all it does is we initialize a Flask application, we return Bart Simpson, and then we call app.run. Now, in order to, we wanted to Dockerize this, right? So you can see what we're doing here. Start from Python, change the working directory to user source app, copy into the image the requirements.txt file, and then once this file, right, from my host computer, from the laptop, copy that into the image. And then once this is copied into the image, we can install, install my libraries, and then we can copy the rest of the code base, right? Meaning here it's pretty simple. It's just like this project folder that has this one file. And then finally we can run Flask run, and what we do have to do is to say that the host, you do this host 4 zeros. What this does, remember, in order to say that basically any computer can make a request to our Flask application, that this is the argument that we provide, right? So normally we don't have to worry about this because we're booting this thing up on our laptop and we're making requests to Flask from our laptop. In this case, however, right, we're going to be booting this up inside a Docker container. And so we have to tell Flask, hey, you're running this inside Docker, but let this other entity communicate directly with Flask. So that's what these 4 zeros are here for. All right. So here, we'll build our Docker image. And that will be it, right? This will boot up our Flask application. Now, so we could do that. We could do Docker. Let's see this. Docker build dot, and we want to do -t. We'll call this my Flask app dot, and then build it here. We can see we're installing the requirements. Hopefully this stuff works. It looks fine, right? Docker run -p, right? We have to map the port. And what port does this run on? I think 5000. We could see just by booting it and seeing what it says. But I'm going to map my local computer's, my laptop's port of 3000 to the Flask app of 5000, and then run the Flask app image. All right. Let's just see. And it breaks. Oh, okay. One thing I'm not doing, you can see it says cannot locate Flask application. The issue is I did not specify an environmental variable here. Remember, if you do Flask run, right, it's going to have to, it's just what we do here, right? You're going to have to specify an environmental variable, meaning where does the Flask app live? So you'll have to specify, okay, the Flask app lives in this project dunder init.py file. All right, let's actually do this. This is a good point to move over to Docker Compose, because that's going to allow us not only to encode these command line arguments, but also to encode something like the environmental variable, I hope. All right, so here's what we can do. We have our project here. We have our Docker file here. We can make a new file for Docker Compose. Let's do that. .yaml. So do Docker Compose.yaml. And the first thing we can do, it really just takes 2 arguments, or 2 root level keys. One is the version number, which I'll do 3.7. This is the version of the Docker API that we're using. And the second thing is services, which is, remember we talked about how we have various services we can specify, like the database, the backend API, and the front-end API, or in the front-end user interface. Here we'll just do the backend. All right, and then the next thing we can do is specify, okay, we'll call this the web service, and then let's just do this for now. And you can start to see, right, I can specify the ports as mapping 3000 to 5000. So this is taking my command line argument, right, and encoding it, and mapping the port from 3000 to 5000. This, maybe I'll talk, this dash right here is to specify that this is really a list. This is a list in YAML, meaning that we could have multiple mappings. Like say we wanted to map multiple ports, like we wanted to map port like 4000 5432, right, to my laptop's port of 5432. We can do that as well. You just need to put a dash in front. So here I'm saying ports is a list and it has one element. All right, that's what this dash is for. All right, and then the next thing we could do is the environment. And here I can just put the environmental variable as Flask app equals project / dunder init.py. So why am I doing this? Remember, when I boot up this image, it's going to call Flask run. That means it needs to know which file to call, and what it's going to call is, and the way that it knows that is from an environmental variable provided in the image of the Flask app is this project init.py. All right, that will, I think I can do one more thing, which is to specify the image. We could do this. And that can be my Flask app image. I think that's fine. Let's see. So to boot this up, we can do docker compose up, I believe. And we have to do this from a directory that has docker compose.yaml. All right. This is kind of interesting. So notice, first of all, it's not breaking here. It is saying serving app from this project init.py. Here we're running on 5000, but this is, remember, the containers port. So really, I should be looking for this in port 3000. So let's go there. Okay, this is good, right? This is our root not found / users. And here we see Bart Simpson. Okay, so that makes sense. So it's booting up this image, right? We're mapping the port 3000 to 5000. We're specifying, and I'm going to show you this. We're specifying the Flask app, that this environmental variable, Flask app, is project init.py. We did this by encoding this, right? And then just by running docker compose up. Notice that it's booting up this container, users web. I'm trying to think how I can actually connect into it. I think I can do docker compose exec -it. This is the name of the container, and then bash, and I broke it. Sorry. I think I have to just see it's saying there is no configuration found. I think I have to do this from my Docker, from like the same directory. So that's gonna be, let me boot it. Let me turn this off. I can just press Control-C to turn it off. And then we'll do pwd, and then let's cd. All right, so here I have my Docker Compose file. I'll do Docker Compose up. You can put the hyphen or you cannot put the hyphen. It's up to you. I think the newer way is to not put the hyphen. And now what I wanted to do was to, so one, we can see the various Docker Compose containers running. You see this? So this is the user service. Let me do Docker Compose PS. There we go. This is better. So this is the name of the container that's running, and it's giving it users web. Users is the project name, and then web is the name of the service. And I think I can do docker compose exec -it users web 1 bash. I'd like to connect to it. Man, is not running. Let me. Okay, is this, shoot. So I'm having issues actually connecting into this. Let me see. Exec into Docker Compose container. Docker Compose exec. Docker Compose exec, and then it should be the name of the container, I'm guessing. I'm surprised it's saying, oh, web. So you can use a command in your services. So now it says I could do something like web sh. Let me see if that works. I don't know. Oh, that's interesting. So it's just the bash command that didn't work. It wasn't, do you see this? When I do docker compose execute the ls command against the web service, that works fine, right? But it's just this docker compose execute the bash command, that command it doesn't see. So instead, let's try sh, and there we're in. Okay, so effectively, I'm just using a base image that doesn't have access to bash, but does have access to the sh command. All right, that's the issue. And in order to exec into my container, I just did docker compose exec and then the name of the service that I wanted to exec into, followed by the command I wanted to run, which was sh. And what I wanted to show you, can I do this? Oh, print env, is that we specified, right? We were able to provide our Flask app environmental variable. And where did that come from? That came from specifying it here. Okay? So really all the steps that we wanted to perform, right, we encoded in my Docker Compose file. Right? The image, the ports, and the environment. And then in order to boot this up, right, we did Docker Compose up, and we had to do that from the directory that had my Docker Compose file. And then the next thing we saw was we can see, we exec into this Docker Compose exec -it web, the name of the service, sh. And then we also did Docker Compose ps to see the list of running containers. All right, so this was the first, right, use case of Docker Compose, which is that it encodes our command line arguments. Any questions before I move on?
So if you do Docker container ls, it won't show that image. I mean that container.
Yeah, I don't know that. Let me see. Actually, it did. Yeah, so it did use it. It did show it this way. Normally, I will do Docker Compose PS in order to see it because it shows me the containers just pertaining to this project, you know, as opposed to other containers that might be running, right? Other questions? All right, one other thing you can do is specify the build as well. So for this, we'll do, say we want to like rebuild the image. So we'll have to specify the build context, right? Like where is our Docker file, right? And when we say something like copy files, from where are we talking about, right? So we'll say, okay, what is the build context? So we'll do context is dot, right? And then we'll also specify the Docker file. All right. So here we're just saying, okay, the name of the Docker file is just called Docker file. So you could, call this something different, but this is fine. And then we can just do Docker Compose build. I think that's fine. And you can see it's building that. We happen to provide an image name, so it's building it as this image. If you didn't provide an image name, it will create its own. It will probably be users-web. So it will find its own name. Just use a default, but this is fine. All right, so hopefully you can read this, right? We're specifying this service. It's 2 root level keys. One is the version, one is services. Then we specify the various services. Here we only have one. And we specify the build. And then these command line arguments, right? Or things that used to be command line arguments, like the port and the environment here. Okay. And one thing I'd say is like it's important just to get down the order of operations, right? Like first get the Flask app running, then build Docker file, like build the image, get that working, or try to, and then move over to Docker Compose. All right, let's go to the next thing. And that is the CD, I know I spelled it wrong, Molity Services Compose. Let's close this down. All right, so this is more complicated, right? This now we have multiple services. You can see we have this one called API, and we also have another one called DB, all right, for the database. With the, and you know, remember I said like what's useful about Docker Compose, it allows these services to talk to each other, okay? So there's not too much new here, you know, like if you look at this DB service, we use an image of Postgres, right? So this is like the Postgres image. If it doesn't find it locally, it will pull it from Docker Hub. Here, remember, I don't know, you probably don't remember, in the Postgres image, you can specify environmental variables, right? It allows you to, if you specify an environmental variable of Postgres user, then it creates a user inside Postgres, right, in that image called, you know, whatever this is, and then the password as well. So here I'm just allowing myself to connect to the database with a username and password, right? I'm setting it here in the image, and this is just from the documentation. I just know that that occurs. The other thing is, I guess, map the port 5432 to the outside port of 5432. And then finally, I want to save my data in a volume. All right, so when I like write to Postgres, right, if I save data in Postgres, remember when we shut down the container, that data is lost, right? So what I need to do is say, okay, anything that's written to here, to this /data folder, actually save it in this volume called Postgres data.
Jeff, what if you don't want to show this password there?
You could, there's different things you could do. I think that you could like have this as an environmental variable and then read the environmental variable into here. Maybe someone knows. Yeah, it is a good question. So anyway, it's something like that. I'll have to look it up, but I think that you can read this in as an environmental variable, and so then store this in your AWS or say some other environment, and then read from there. Okay, but I'll have to look up. I would have to look up how to do that. Okay, the most important thing to know about this next step is actually right here. Okay, so what's happening here is we're saying, all right, I'm going to connect. You know, I have this database URL that like this is where we'll connect to in Flask. So if you look at Flask, we're saying, okay, get this database URL from the environment. How does it get that? Well, it goes to the Docker Compose file, and we're specifying it, right? We're setting a database URL here, right? An environmental variable called database URL right here. So here we're going to read in that database URL, and then what we're doing is we're just setting my connection. This is a way for me to like use, I guess, this other library, but it's like scikop-g2, where specifying the connection data so that we can connect to our database. Now, when doing that, so it's like you have this Postgres. This is the user, Jigsaw Labs. This is the password. All right. This normally is like the endpoint, right? This normally, if this was like an RDS instance in Amazon, this would be the URL that this lived in. But in this case, it's this other Postgres service. So the way that we can connect to this Postgres service is just to specify the service name. In other words, the endpoint is the service name. All right? So it's @db, port 5432. and we're able to access DB port 5432 here. And then this is just the database name, Jigsaw Labs, which I think by default, the user, if you specify a user, it will create a database of that same name. All right. So like I said, the most important thing, like remember we said that Docker Compose allows our services to talk to one another. This is it. Like this is how we're doing that. Instead of having to find, okay, where exactly does this thing live in the Docker universe, we just specify the service name, and this is the connection to this running service. Right? It's just like the endpoint. All right.
And so that 5432 you have at the end, that's going to be referencing the 5432 that you exposed
exactly.
in
The one that you exposed. Yeah. So that's why we have to do this, right? Is to reference the one that we've exposed inside this Docker Compose world. All right, and then we're keeping the same environmental variable of, okay, here's when I boot up my Flask app, right? It runs it sets the project init.py as the Flask app environmental variable. It's also going to, and then this is just the same, right? It knows when we say Docker Compose, what are we booting up? I don't have to specify, I guess, the image name because it's just it can take it from here. It can say, okay, whichever, if it doesn't see the image, it will build this and then give it a name and know that this is what I want to boot up when I do Docker Compose up. It'll build this and then start the container. And when it starts the container, it runs this command, right? Flask run, expose the host, right? Map the port so that I can access it on my laptop to 3000. This depends on DB, says do not start this service until this service is started first, right? Why do I need to do that? Because we need to connect to this Postgres service before we boot up my Flask application, right? Once this Flask application or container boots up, it's going to connect, I guess here, right? It creates the connection and then immediately we'll create a users table and insert in a value, right? And then here we'll select all from users. So we have to wait until, in order to run these commands, right? We need to wait until we have a running database, okay? And then I think we're good. So I'll do Docker Compose up. And you can see this is we have two different containers running, and then breaks. It says port 3000 is already allocated. That's because I'm using it here. So I'm going to shut this down. I'm just pressing Control-C right here. So this was from the previous part of the lecture. And then we'll just do Docker Compose up again. So you can see we're running these two services. These are just two different containers. And then the magic is that I'm able to access this URL from here, the URL of the other service. It's just DB. Okay. And yeah, now let's go to 3000. Right, this is correct. If I go to users, that will take me to users here. And here's Maggie. You can see I have Maggie showing up 4 times. That's because I'm connected to a volume, and every time it's doing this insert into. But this isn't, we would maybe just run this once against our database, like run a migration, and it would be saved in a volume. We wouldn't do this every time. Okay. So one thing to note is this is just a URL. I'm pretty sure this DB magic thing works. This bit of magic will work directly in the string, like inside the container. So if you do something like this DB, I think still references, okay, the DB service from Docker Compose. Let's see. Let's do that again. Let's just confirm that. Docker Compose build. So I'm rebuilding. It's taking a second. Let's take a look at the Docker file. I had to, because this is connecting to Postgres, I had to install these libraries as well. I don't know. I Googled it until I found it. But you can see what this Flask up is doing. Otherwise, it's basically the same, right? Starting from Python, changing the working directory, installing the Postgres dependency, copying requirements, installing it, copying the rest of the code base, then running this. All right. So that has... yeah, go ahead.
What is APK?
I don't know. I just don't...
Is it APT or APK?
APK. Run APK. I think it's some sort of like package manager, right? That's my guess.
And I think it should be APT, like sudo APT, like in the Ubuntu or something, but I don't know. Maybe APK.
I don't know. All right, now we'll do Docker Compose up, right? And I just wanted to see, will this, I'm almost positive it will, but that this DB, right, magic, we don't have to specify an endpoint. By saying DB from another, from a Docker container, we're able to, let's just, right, we got that 5th Maggie Simpson now, right? So this is really the magic right here, is I can connect to these services just by specifying not like any endpoint. The endpoint is the service name. Oh, thanks, Pankaj. So it's Alpine Linux, Alpine Package Keeper. But it's just a package manager. So it's just a way for us to install these packages. Same way we might do a pip install of different packages. All right, so you can see, right, like one, we're able to, we can, specify the environmental variable here, but the magic is this DB thing. And the reason why I keep mentioning this is, like in the lab, I think what you'll have, right, is you'll have a front-end application and a back-end application, right? And the front-end application is going to need to make a request to the back-end app, right? So how will it do something like that? Import requests.get to what? To the API, right? It doesn't need to say localhost 5000. I think it should just be API, right? The name of the service is the endpoint, right? It might be API colon 5000. That's probably what it is. Slash, right? Slash users or whatever, right? And that will get back. This will be the correct URL, right? So you can see how this is equivalent to what we have in the code base here, which is connect to what? Not the endpoint, just the name of the service, colon the port number, right? And then the rest is the same. Okay. So that's Docker Compose. Let's just make sure we got it again. Right, you can see that it allows us to have this microservices pattern where each one of these different containers, right, is a different service. And right, the two main things that we get from it is, one, we can take our command line arguments and actually, write them as a file and save it. So it's, as these things become more complicated, it's easier. It's easier to actually just boot up. And then two, allows our images and allows these containers to communicate with one another, right? So you saw that with the case of the DB, where we don't have to worry about where this thing is running. We just specify the service name. That is the endpoint. Yeah. Okay. So the Docker Compose file. You can see that the build context, right, we're specifying as basically inside each folder, because that's where each Docker file will live. So for example, inside front end, right, we have a Docker file, and that so we say the build context is actually front end, and that's where you can find the Docker file. And then in that Docker file, that's where, we say, okay, here's the working directory, pull out the requirements.txt from this front end folder, right? Install it, copy it. We have to, I think we had to expose port 8501 because that's what Streamlit is running on. And then you do this as the Streamlit command, right? And we know we have to put this command line, right, separate it as each element in a list, right? And make sure you have double quotes here. All right, let's go back to the Docker Compose file somewhere. All right, so we have, this is the build context, which means look inside here and find the Docker file. We're mapping the port. This is mapping port 8501 in the Streamlit container to port 8501 in my, in the Streamlit container to port 8501 on my host computer. The depends on API means that this is going to build this service first, right? And then this part right here is bind mounting, right? It's bind mounting front end source into the container. So this way, as I change code locally on my laptop, right, the container is actually reading from this folder front end source. So you can see right here, if I change like this, my first app 1, and refresh, it should immediately change, right? So that's occurring because we're doing the bind mounting, right? Saying, hey, actually read to it on my laptop. All right. Notice that what I'm doing, because I think a lot of us are running into this issue where port 5000 is already taken on our host computer. So what we're doing is we're mapping to port, like another port. Like for me, it's port 3000. And here again, same thing. I'm doing the build context is API, meaning look inside of this folder, the Docker file, and run, right? I have to specify host all zeros so that an external service, right, something outside of this Docker container can access, can make a request to my Flask application. This is not where you have to, like, this doesn't mean visit on, like, we still visit from the same port, or from the same URL, 127.0.0.1. But this just says, hey, allow other computers to access, to make requests to my Flask application. One confusing thing that confused me, and I gave wrong information on, is when you are making a request here, I'm making the request to the service name :5000. This is the port, the original port that Flask was running on. Even though, if you look at my Docker Compose file, I'm mapping the port from 5000 to 3000. Apparently, this is just for outside of the Docker Compose world, right? So this is running, the API is running on port 5000. That's where Flask is running. And even though I'm able to access it on my laptop at port 3000, inside the Docker Compose world, apparently, I should still be accessing to the original port. I should still be making the request to the original port. So you can see that when I go to this front end, I just put the name of the service, API, :5000, that original port locations, and that's making the GET request. And then that worked fine. And then the last thing that threw me off was to actually go get Streamlit. I did localhost, not, for whatever reason, I cannot access it from whatever it said. It said that it was available from here, but this didn't work for me. All right, I had to access it from localhost 8501. Other things, specifying the environmental variables, right? This threw people off. It wasn't as simple as just saying it threw people off, but just know, we had to specify, okay, here's our Flask app, restaurants init.py. If you had an issue with like debugging this, what I would like, you got some sort of error about maybe this module doesn't exist or something like that. What I would do is like kind of use your debugging skills. I can show you real fast to maybe connect to it. So by that I mean we should do Docker compose. Sorry, I'm keeping over. Docker compose exec, exec. The name of the service sh, really exec dash it sh, and then I'm in, right, and I can look around and see, okay, here's restaurants. What's my environment? Okay, here's Flask app. Going to /restaurants /init, and maybe even from there you can try, Flask run or whatever. Right? So this was actually running properly. It just recreated the table. But this environmental variable stuff looks fine. All right. So, if you get an error like that of, okay, can't find the Flask app or can't find this thing, restaurants, I would sh, right? Docker compose exec dash it, the name of the service, sh into the container to debug. Okay, I pushed my code. I'll put it in Slack. I'm not saying it's beautiful. Probably far from it, but I think it works. Hold on. Okay. So here's the solution. My solution branch is right here. Let me put that in Slack for all of you. Okay.